So let's talk a little bit about rapid prototyping. Because as you see from our stack, what we've focused on a lot is being able to build the experience really fast, get it out in usability testing, and we actually preserve the same bits for production. So we don't actually throw that mock-up away, that prototype away. We actually, that grows into the real product. And we're doing that all across the board in every one of our projects, which is a little different, right? But what's happened is the state of the art. I believe we've hit a tipping point to where it's actually pretty easy, if you're a good HTML, CSS, JavaScript developer, to create good solid code that looks really good, really fast, and you don't have to sacrifice a lot of quality. Now, you don't want to, in the early phases, be worried about all your accessibility and maybe content separation and a whole bunch of other stuff like that. You can delay that. But do you remember I showed that lean UX track and then I showed that agile track? So as it moves more down to that agile track where you're hardening for engineering, there you go ahead and say, okay, it's stable enough that I can separate the content, which doesn't take that long. Use our content tags, so our content's in the content repository, so it can be localized, internationalized, all that kind of stuff. We can start making sure we've addressed accessibility. But look, if we're good engineers, we sort of know these things already, so we'll try not to box ourselves in a corner by writing really crappy code, right? So I think you can actually write good prototype code and it not be crappy. And that's kind of it. So using HTML for prototyping. Now, to your point, your question earlier, in the back, what's your name?
Matthew.
Matthew, okay, cool. So Matthew's point earlier is really good, is that one size doesn't fit all. Paper prototypes are awesome. Sketching on a whiteboard, going to a customer and showing them even a PDF click-through sometimes can help. But there's nothing that really replaces, with a customer, actually seeing a tool that looks like it's a real thing, that really is working and they can interact with. You learn the most there, because the more leaps of inference they have to have. Depends on what you're trying to do. If you're early in that phase where you're just trying to find, what the customer's problems are, those sort of things, don't invest too heavily in any kind of prototyping or whatever, because you end up futzing with the technology and all that. But what's happened now is that with things like Twitter Bootstrap, for example, you can build a pretty nice looking UI. It's hard to make it ugly, right? It may not function well, but at least it'll look decent. So there's also a new thing called Jetstrap I just saw the other day, which is basically a drag and drop kind of interface for Bootstrap. I haven't had a chance to play with it much, but it looks pretty cool. In fact, I'm planning on reaching out to those guys and having a conversation with them, because I think it's a pretty cool thing they're heading down. Let's see, what else? This one here, this forcing function thing, this is really interesting because I kind of insist on us working in this model, at least for now, because one of my not so hidden agendas is I don't want designers going off and doing it in a vacuum away from engineers. I want there to be a lot of collaboration. So when designers are sketching or whiteboarding, or maybe even using something like Azure or some prototyping tool, they have to get touchback base as soon as possible with engineering to continue to refine that prototype, because that is the living spec. And that's what customers are going to interact with in usability testing. So by doing that, it's a forcing function to make design and engineering work together. So you see my clever trick there. It's actually and it's worked. It's worked really well, right? So I suggest Twitter Bootstrap, especially using jQuery. There's probably other good stuff, but it's really great. They've done a good service. What other things do you guys use for? Do you do HTML prototyping? What do you use? Do you just have your own kind of kits, or do you use Twitter Bootstrap, or various and sundry? Yeah. Yeah. If you haven't had a chance to play with Twitter Bootstrap, check it out. It's extremely good. And with what we found out with, by using Less or a CSS preprocessor, it has a single style sheet, with the variables, for all your styles and such. We were able to go in just a couple of hours, tweak it to have the PayPal look, our new look, and then it just boom was there, right? So that was pretty cool. I have on my blog by that horrible little bit.ly swiftledowers URL. But if you go to my blog and look for laundry list of prototyping tools, looksgoodworkswell.com. I have 30 or 40 listed there. And if you know more, let me know. I just keep adding that laundry list. We've used Azure a lot. Azure allows you to, it's been around a long time actually. I started using it in the, God, I don't know, 7 years ago, 8 years ago, 9 years ago, something like that. It was more like, looked like a little dumbed down Visio sort of at the time. But you can actually build full, clickable, Ajax looking kind of experiences, right? I'd say the only problem is that it gets you away from that forcing function of designers and engineers working together if you spend too much time in it. InVision's another where you can create kind of clickables and you can share them through a URL and get feedback and notes and annotation. There's a bunch of different ones that are out there. Simple thing, use Chrome. To me, it's like I don't. It's funny, I don't use Firefox anymore except to test on. I used to only use Firefox. It's funny how the world's changed. It's like, yeah, Chrome's been a good gift to us. So when you're trying to do the prototyping stuff, just say, hey, everybody has to use Chrome. That's why we use our usability testing, use everybody else. Then we have to get into a whole mess of stuff, I think that pretty much says it. I'd say if you aren't using Node for production, use Node.js for your app prototyping. And I know a number of companies that have started using Node for prototyping and then figured out, well, dude, we don't want to do it any other way, so let's just make it our production. That's what's happening with us. As more and more people, I was talking to the guys at Yahoo, Thierry and the others who run the Cocktails project. Are you familiar with the Cocktails project? That's the Yahoo Node project. It's the overall. So they have Mojito. Mojito is the, these are all different cocktails, obviously. So Mojito is like the UI kind of ability to have components and stuff like that. And they have Manhattan. Manhattan is kind of like the, it's all the stuff that makes nodes so that you can kind of run it in production, harden it and all that. And they're going to be releasing this whole suite as an open source set. They've got some of it out right now. And it sounds like they're doubling down with Marissa on board at Google, from Google. So I was talking to them and they said, the developers who have had the hardest time switching to Node are the PHP developers. But the Java developers, they were initially like, oh, what is this stuff? And they use it and they're converted and they don't ever want to go back to Java. And we're kind of seeing the same thing at PayPal too. Like we got this one guy he was like a rock star, been a C++ developer, Java developer. And we started talking about Node. He's like, why the hell would anybody use Node? That's a toy, blah, blah. Next thing we know, he's like one of our biggest contributors on our GitHub. Like first thing he did, in the next week, Webflow has this, so Spring has this thing called Webflow where you XML, you define your workflows, your flow logic. He wrote a JSON-based one for Node called Inflow, right? And you basically describe your flow in JSON, and so he's like a total convert, and we've seen this over and over. Of course, those of you who have used Node know that it has a really rich ecosystem of modules, and Node is basically, if you're not familiar with it, Node.js is basically an evented I/O system, so that if you have data-bound or I/O-bound applications, which most of our websites and stuff, web apps are. It allows you, instead of having to spawn threads and everything else to process these various requests coming in, you end up just using the closure concept, callback concept from JavaScript and saying, hey, go fire and forget. You get a callback when it's done. And it's a much more efficient way to handle all those different requests coming in and manage those when they come. So we use Express module for routing, async, because async you can wrap, and instead of having to write in a real nested, kind of closure mindset, you can put them in like they're just regular lines of code, but it takes that whole thing and asyncs it basically. And then we use a require.js, for our modularization. We use it both for the Node side as well as the browser side to keep it simple. And How many have you used something like Require? A few, okay. So one of the biggest benefits of doing development in Node that'll change the way you do your JavaScript is you'll adopt a module pattern. And with modules, you'll set package dependencies, module dependencies. And with Require.js, it's really good especially on the client side, because it can handle all those, deferred loading, asynchronous loading of things that you're dependent upon, and just manage that for you. You can do the same thing for CSS, and so Require is really nice there, but it also changes the way you think about your JavaScript code, because you start thinking about it more in modules, and you get away with worrying about trying to make it look like classical OO or anything like that. You just embrace the nature of kind of what it feels right for JavaScript, and you'll find yourself writing both your browser and your Node logic the same way, and that's pretty cool. So I think that's a huge switch in your thinking. So we have this thing called Node Web Core or Node Bootstrap, and that's something we'll probably be soon releasing to open source. It's like Yeoman though, so I'd encourage you to go look at Yeoman. Yeoman was really pretty rich and powerful. It's by a guy named Paul Irish at Google. He's like one of the Chrome evangelists, really smart guy. Probably if you've been to some conferences, you probably heard Paul speak.